This is another iROAR podcast.
Welcome back to season 6 of the Animal Highlight, where we're focused in on animals and museum collections and objects. And in today's episode, I think we're definitely focusing in on a collection. And specifically, we're speaking about how a whole host of objects in this collection were stolen and the types of questions that this raises about the value of museums, of collections, of preservation. What is the point of doing all of this, and what harms are done when they're stolen or when they're disrupted? Hello, Rosa. Welcome back to the Animal Highlights. It's your second last script, which is very exciting. So who are we talking about today?
So today we're in our museum space, and this time we're going to kind of go backstage. So instead of focusing on objects that are on display or the little beasties that are in between those objects that we were talking about last week with the wasps and moths, we're instead going to look at objects that are in the kind of back area of the museum. So the collections that as a member of the public you might not see, but I think also have really interesting stories to talk about. I'm afraid we are talking about birds again, but no surprises there.
But that's such an important thing, because I think when people go into museums, I don't know how many people think about the massive collections that are unseen, right? Like, because museums, depending on the museum you go into, they sometimes seem so huge in and of themselves. They just seem massive. But then, and this goes for any museum, right? Whether it's an art museum, whether it's a natural history museum, there's so much more that we don't see as visitors, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think it's usually like less than 1% of what's on display generally is what's actually in the collection. It's often centered in these kind of strange discussions about repatriation that, this anxiety we're going to empty the museum if we give anything back or change it. And I think, some people I think don't realize that there's literally often millions of objects in drawers and storage kind of in the back area of places. So yeah, I thought we'd give that some time today. So we're going to be slightly, I guess, gender bending with our not gender bending, genre bending with our episode today. And I hope we're not going to veer too much into the true crime podcast, but I do think it's quite a fun story. But if we get a bit too kind of serial about it, do bring me back to the animals, but it is a really fun story. So we're going to enter into the really strange world of, firstly, museum skin collections. So one of these kind of research collections that aren't necessarily visible but are really important. And then also this really weird, strange crime that happened to do with the theft of some of these collections, and this strange man called Edwin Rist, whose name is also quite difficult to say, but we'll work it out.
I'm so happy that you also struggle with saying names. I'm not alone.
Oh my gosh. So obviously we want to focus on the animals always in that highlights, but I'm just going to give a bit of a background context first, I think, to kind of set the crime scene, because I think it's important. So one of the lesser known areas of natural history museums is this area backstage, which is usually what was called a research collection or a science collection. So these might be hundreds or thousands or even millions of specimens of kind of organism or animals or natural objects which are used for research. So bird collections like those held at the Natural History Museum at Tring in London, or there's a huge one at the Smithsonian, for example, will have thousands and thousands and thousands of drawers of bird specimens, usually called bird skins, that represent the vast majority of the world's known species and might have kind of famous individuals, so things like, for example, Darwin's finches, or specimens that are representative of, particular important events or places in history. But they're also just, hundreds and hundreds of the same species in a single drawer. And the idea is that you get a representative of the population of these species so that they can be studied in a way that doesn't require the live animal to be there. So the storeroom where the birds are kept is sort of intimidating when you go into it. I certainly kind of took a step back and was slightly kind of out of place when I first went into it. So it's a huge temperature-controlled kind of warehouse-like room that requires often special security clearance to get into. The atmosphere is quite weird, so there's a slightly odd smell. The corridors are often dark, and as you walk along, the kind of lights trigger as you go down these rooms of, hundreds and hundreds of kind of white cabinets that are full of dead birds. So it does have this weird sort of morgue-like quality to it. Which in many ways it is. It's full of hundreds of dead birds. So from floor to ceilings are these white metal cabinets, and each drawer, if you pull them out, will have a kind of entire array of a single species of birds. And they're called bird skins because usually the organic material is removed, so it's not a wet collection. And Some of the skeleton might be there, so the feet might be there, but usually it's just the skin of the bird with the feathers still attached.
Were they put in originally as like a whole plump, fleshy bird, and that's just what's happened over time, or are they put into these drawers as skins?
No, so they're pre-prepared, so they enter the collection usually as just the skin. So the idea for them is to, as a researcher, allow you to look at the variety of something like plumage variation across kind of a geography or time, or, just variation across a population. It also allows you to take specimens from the skin and from the feathers if you want to do research on, particular things you can get from those samples. So it's different from having a skeleton or having kind of flesh samples, which would be a different type of collection. But what these specimens are really important for are things called type specimens. So oftentimes when you're describing a new species, you'll have a type specimen, which would be, this bird is this big, has this type of plumage, and you might have that as part of a skin collection. So it can be, if you have a bird that you can't identify, you can bring it to one of these bird collections and use it to compare, basically. So these collections are used by researchers for a huge range of things. So the kind of work I was doing with them I really enjoyed it. It was called forensic ornithology. I felt very cool doing it, which was trying to identify when I had, a single feather on a headdress that I didn't know what bird it was trying to kind of match it to the species by using it was called whole feather analysis. So being a detective and trying to find out where the feather had come from. But people also use it for things like genetic analysis and kind of microsampling, things like that. So yeah, they're really basically valuable collections. They're massive. They're used for a whole variety of things. But this wasn't a sentiment shared by a man called Edwin Rist, who was the culprit of one of probably the most bizarre museum crimes I've ever heard of. I do want to say as well, a lot of the details I'm getting about this are from this amazing book called The Feather Thief by this man called Clarke Johnson, who wrote about this case. And you just if anyone's interested in it, you just have to read it because it's a beautifully written book and there's so many different threads of interest in it. But also because we're kind of doing an animal highlights episode, I thought I'd take that story but focus in really in detail about who the victims of the crime were. So who were the birds that were stolen? Because they're some of the most beautiful and kind of visually striking birds in the world. And I think thinking about these qualities of beauty and rarity and uniqueness is really interesting, both as targets of the crime, but also in thinking about their own life histories and how they kind of would have lived before they entered the collection. So what was the Great Feather Heist? So in 2009, one person, Edwin Rist, who was strangely a very talented flautist who was in London studying music, decided that some of the birds at Tring had potential not just as scientific specimens, but also to be lucrative, I guess, objects, or I don't really know what the word is, commodities maybe, that he could sell and get a lot of money for. So having cased the collection before, he pretended to be a photographer and came and visited. He then came back at night and broke into the collection with a suitcase and stole just under 300 skins of beautiful coloured birds, many of which were just really rare and, hugely valuable.
Are you allowed to go into these places with a suitcase?
No. So he broke in at night, I think. He broke a window and came in with his suitcase. So he kind of cased out the place first. He posed, I think, as a photography student who wanted to take pictures of the birds, and then came back later at night and broke in. And the reason behind the theft was just completely bizarre. I mean, I don't know, I might just be ill-informed, but the reason was to sell the feathers to the salmon fly tying community, which I'll raise my hands up, did not know was a thing, to be honest. And I think it's quite a niche hobby where enthusiasts use exotic bird feathers to create fishing lures. It's an art from the Victorian times, I think, and the people that practice it today still use Victorian-era recipes for doing it. And the kind of value and allure of it is using often really rare or spectacular bird specimens that are hard to get hold of. So Rist participated in this hobby and, as a result of this theft, sold at least £100,000 worth of feathers to fellow enthusiasts as a result of the heist. And so while the motive behind the crimes sounds almost humorously bizarre if you don't know much about tying, I suppose, I didn't really, and I think it's kind of, if you're just listening to it in 30 seconds, it's quite a funny story. But I think as I was thinking through it more, the impact of what removing those skins from the collection was actually really great. So many of the skins he took were really old specimens. They were over 100 years old, reflecting populations which are now really threatened. And also most whose trade is really, really tightly controlled. So the reason he was able to get so much money for them is because they're just not available on the market. They shouldn't be traded. They're protected species. One thing that was interesting, though, is that Rist, he had broken in, he had the opportunity to steal anything. He didn't go for what ornithologically or from a kind of natural history perspective might be seen as the most valuable specimens. So he didn't go for things like Darwin's Galapagos finches, for example, which were there. He didn't go for extinct species like the great auk, which was also there. I think largely because he didn't think they were beautiful enough. The point was to get beautiful feathers for fly tying. So it was really something very attached to this particular value system that was, prized in the fly tying community.
So which kind of birds did you say he stole?
So this is like what kind of got me into this as an animal thing, is that they're beautiful. I'll put them in the blog post because they're really difficult, obviously, to portray over, but I think just the names of them give a really good picture. So some of the species are called something like the spangled cottinger, the crimson fruit crow, the resplendent quetzal, the magnificent rifle bird, the superb bird of paradise, were to name but a few. So
I wish I used words like resplendent more in
I
my
know,
day-to-day
why
life. Like,
don't
I
we
just want
use
to,
that?
I don't know, I just want to step outside one day and be like, wow, what a resplendent day. Like,
It
what a
truly
great
is.
word.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll put photos of them in the blog post because, as you can imagine, they are just stunning. And they ranged from all over the world, so from South and Central America to New Guinea. Some of them were famous ones, so one from I think the Alfred Russell collection was stolen, so one of the ones that may have helped discover natural selection.
So he didn't just take like one drawer and empty out that drawer and
No,
quickly rush out. He was very particular about
he seems to have been,
which
I think he knew what he wanted and, really targeted these species that he knew would be highly valued by this particular community. Um, so, but from all over the world, from all over places, probably from all over the collection, they're not all from a single genus or something. They would have been next to each other, as you say. But they all are united by being stunningly beautiful. And also really kind of uniquely beautiful, a lot of them. So I think we mentioned this when we were talking about the hummingbirds, but that a lot of these species have, these really unique qualities of things like iridescence or like really rich pigments that these tropical birds have, which aren't present in a lot of other species. So something like the resplendent quetzal, for example, is just like beautifully brilliant turquoise, and it's kind of amazing when you see it in person what that's like. And if you were like to put them, put all the birds he stole into, some kind of fantasy aviary, I think it'd probably be the most amazing thing you'd ever seen, all of these colours collected. And so, when I was reading through his book and I got to this point and I kind of wanted to pause at this point, and I felt like, it was time to kind of, not to use the phrase, but like hold space for the birds and kind of actually see how these colours can be reconnected back to their life histories. So I thought, if you don't mind, we'll pause the feather heist story for a moment and think about actually who the birds were, because obviously I think that's where we want to go with this podcast. So plumage colour is fueled by a number of things. So it's fueled by both natural and sexual selection in birds. So for male birds in particular, it seems to be an important component of their life histories. So bright and unusual plumage has been argued to play a crucial role for things like influencing mate choice and also for how successful you are once you've kind of got to the point of reproducing. So the males of a species being so highly coloured may inform both how females select a mate, but also may help with male-male competition between species as well. So if you've got a particularly bright or beautiful tail feather, for example, you might be able to claim dominance over other males and therefore have greater access to females. And also is about, females then making a selection about who they find most impressive as a partner. It's also possible as well that the brightness of plumage can say positive things about what's inside you. So things like your hormones or your immunity might be expressed through having kind of brighter plumage, and having dull plumage could be an indicator you might have something like parasites or some kind of vitamin deficiency, things like that. So being beautiful and being brightly coloured and kind of resplendent is actually something that can be an indicator that you're a good bet as a mate.
Isn't it true though, like, I mean, because we're also thinking about color here from, I guess, a human eye, but isn't it true that sometimes birds that look a bit dull to us might be resplendent because many species of birds can see in different color wavelengths, right? They can see, I forget which bird, I don't know if it's the starling. I'm going to get this wrong, but I know that there's several birds that we think of as just really drab, but to each other, they look absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I've read that as well. And again, my mind is blanking. I want to say puffin for some reason, but I could just be absolutely pulling that out of thin air. But if you look at them under UV light, they're really brilliant and they reflect back at you. And we don't like fully understand, I think, how birds' eyes work and compared to us. So there is a theory that what we're potentially seeing as dull is not the case for those birds. And definitely there's been studies that show kind of the nanostructures of particular bird feathers scatter light in really unique ways that can signal different things for stuff like sexual signaling, for example.
Yeah, it says here, birds of paradise, some species can emit green, yellow, and pale blue light from their bodies, including special patches on their head, feet, and inside their mouths. Um, Pigeons and turacos are species, they have porphyrins, which is a type of feather pigment that glows under UV light. So pigeons, I mean,
That's what I'm thinking of,
we're
yeah. Pigeons, not puffins.
puffins are what I think people think of them. I mean, not maybe in terms of colors, but they're definitely charismatic
They
in
are
a certain
beautiful,
way.
aren't
But
they?
pigeons, yeah, so under UV light, they look a lot more impressive than what, to the human eye at least. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah. So yeah, basically these birds are beautiful, and like weirdly, even though they came from all over the world, a lot of them seem to have been concentrated in tropical regions. And that is something that is scientifically proven, that a lot of birds inhabiting kind of rainforest environments or the tropics do tend to show much more brilliant and beautiful kind of brightness of color and kind of color uniqueness compared to maybe more temperate regions. Interestingly, this is something that Humboldt kind of observed in the 18th century when he came to the Amazon. He said that the closer you are to the tropics, the more beautiful and bright color feather plumage is in bird species. And obviously, there wasn't any real way for him to prove this. It was just kind of a thing he observed. Interestingly, though, really recently, with the development of things like high resolution color imagery, this has been confirmed. It is true that birds closer to the equator do actually like kind of quantifiably have a greater diversity and intensity of color. So broader spectrum, greater intensity compared to birds, the further away you go to the equator. So like interestingly, even though Humboldt was just kind of saying this is an observation, it's now been proven. And the way it's been proven is by using these kind of bird skin collections. So in a way, Rist was kind of, I'm not going to say he was right because I think it was an appalling thing to do. But if you were taking it on like his selection criteria for the most beautiful birds, scientifically, he did choose, some of the most intense and diverse plumage that he could have. And obviously it has cross-species appeal. We as humans obviously find them beautiful, and, things like this crime, but also what we were talking about in the hummingbird episode of things like, the Victorian craze for having bird plumage on hats and stuff really shows that this is a cross-species thing, that we can appreciate the beauty of it. So kind of to return for a minute back to what happened with the feather heist. So kind of very sadly, most of the specimens that he stole just weren't ever recovered. Once he was tracked down, his defense was basically that the collections were obsolete. They're not, they're not really worth much. Whatever kind of science or research that could be done from them has already been done. So actually, it wasn't really much of a crime because he wasn't really losing anything to science. And basically, why shouldn't he? Which, is just wrong on so many levels. But weirdly, actually, the judge in the case seemed to slightly agree with this, because to the dismay of all the museum, people and everything, he was basically just given a suspended sentence when he was put on trial. And I think, focusing in on the birds again, it's so wrong because, like this example with Humboldt, and then, doing these colour studies 100 years later after he's made that observation, these are really important collections. They do continue to be used for the advancement of science and for the advancement of bird conservation. So that was a totally wrong statement for him to make. And I think when we think of collections like this, it's about cumulative knowledge and about what the kind of bodies of these birds serve for science. And if we can justify them as collections, because oftentimes, the birds have been killed in order to be part of these collections, I think, broadly speaking, we can justify them because over hundreds of years, each advance in technology, so, natural and sexual selection, DNA sequencing, things like mass spectrometers for thinking about plumage color. It's allowed us to take a specimen and analyze it in new ways each time. So you're accumulating more and more knowledge about that species to hopefully aid in understanding them better and understanding how to conserve and protect that species better. I think kind of each way we study the species is, creating a new link in that chain of knowledge that's anchored to the bird body that is in the drawer at Tring or Smithsonian or wherever. So yeah, I think that was the bit that really got me riled up, that these aren't, there's no value to these collections, because of course there is, and of course they continue to be used. And so while he claimed they were obsolete and, his whole theft was not much of a big deal, I think nothing could really be further from the truth.
Yeah, and I think, If I understand you correctly there, you were saying that the collections are justified, not necessarily the killing of the birds is justified. Because, yeah, to treat them so flippantly is also to kind of disavow the fact that a lot of these were acquired through often violent means. Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about this in this season already with just how the kind of contradictory moves of naturalists trying to preserve species while at the same time collect them for these collections. And then I think now that they exist in these collections, I think they are owed and due a certain level of respect, not just for their scientific prowess, or potential, but also because that they have specific stories to be told here of how these birds ended up in these drawers. And when they no longer exist there, yeah, I think what this episode also highlights is just how quickly their stories can be subsumed by the story of the person who decides they need them. Do you know what I mean? So this becomes about
Absolutely.
Rist instead of about the animals who um who were acquired in various different ways.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of, we talked about, it's come up a few times in the series about life and afterlife, and kind of the museum is often the space where these afterlives exist. And that can often feel a bit kind of strange in terms of temporality. Like, the after kind of makes it seem like something of a, not future thinking or not hopeful in a way. It's always kind of predetermined by death occurring. And I think the thing, there's a really, I'll link this in the blog post as well. There's a really brilliant, I think she's an anthropologist, called Adrienne Van Allen, who works at the Smithsonian, who writes about practices of care and how people create and present these bird skins. So when a new specimen comes in, how when they're preparing the bird skin, they as practitioners have to think about all the possible ways in which this bird skin might be used in the future for future research. So they have to do it with the sense of care that has to imagine what the future of research might be, what the future of that species might be, and the possibilities of what new technologies might happen. And so I think kind of bird skin collections like the one at Tring or the Smithsonian, they're not kind of obsolete relics of the past that kind of, twee like a Victorian museum or something, but they're constantly being reignited through new research practices and new people coming in and caring for them and caring about those species, even in the afterlife of the animal when, the life is no longer there. I think kind of each individual in the collection holds massive potential for discoveries, and they're shown to be over and over again. And so while it can feel like a morgue, especially when you're walking through it, and, it, a kind of moment I really had is that I think I mentioned him last week. My mum has a rescue African grey called Gus. And I remember pulling open the drawer of the African grey section and just seeing, 100 dead parrots. And like, it really hit me of like, that is not, how I recognize this bird and how this bird kind of exists in my life. But I think when you frame it how Van Allen does as a process of care and kind of hopeful future thinking, I think that is maybe a kind of better way to think about these collections as something that continue to contribute to these chains of knowledge and chains of science that hopefully can help us to protect those species more in the future.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. And I think acknowledging that tension is important, but it doesn't mean throwing away everything, right? And saying that, I think it would also be a mistake to somehow disregard these collections, because they do exist now and there is potential to understand both human and animal histories here, and stories, and like you say, also futures. And I know that this is a general archival practice, not only with animal remains, but also just any sort of artifact that comes into archives, even like sound artifacts, right? You don't know,
Mm.
sometimes something might enter a collection today and seem unimportant in the context of today. But like you say, you don't know what the things are going to look like 50 years from now or 100 years from now, and how the focus on something that seems trivial today might come into focus or be heightened in future. And I think there is something to be said for trying to preserve that moment and that biology and that knowledge. But we also have to just be mindful of how we collect these collections, right? I think indiscriminately killing animals so that we can have collections to understand 50 years from now is there's something ethically dubious there as well, right? And I'm hoping that today it's not something that people would condone, but it was certainly something, 50, 100 years ago that was very much practiced. So there's a difference not only in terms of how we read these collections, but also in terms of how these collections are collected. That's important to recognize, right?
Completely. And I think, this maybe gives a teaser for the next episode, that there's this strange interaction that we have between the individual and the species, or the individual and the population, that, at what point does the kind of balance of morality means killing an individual for your skin collection, which might help research for the whole species in some ways, but that individual life still has a value and still matters in some way. And, I don't think we're, on our 20-minute podcast, we're not going to reach the bottom of that. But I think, there's all these entanglements of morality and care and thinking about these processes that is really complex. And it has no one answer to it. But I think none of the answers are what Rist said. I think we can maybe agree on that.
Yes, I think fair enough. Rist disregarding and saying it's unimportant, what he did was not wrong, is completely not right. So, well, thank you so much. I look forward to what's your last script for the season. So we'll see you again next time. Thank you to Rosa Dyer for co-hosting this Animal Highlight with me, and to Rebecca Shen for designing the episode artwork as well as the Animal Highlight logo. The theme music was done by Clarke, and other episode sound effects come from Pixabay, Epidemic Sound, and Free Sound. This episode was produced by myself. This is the Animal Highlight with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.